What's going on, guys? Reisshub back with another video, and in today's video I want to go over everything I learned from the FNCS warm-up finals. I watched every single win from the NA East region, and I'm just going to put everything that I learned and all of the tendencies and all of the kind of commonalities between all of these wins into one video, just so I can give you a really compact video on it all. Hope you guys enjoy. Okay, so let's look at the first thing, and that would be how contested was their drop and where did they drop? The majority of the players were completely uncontested off of their drop spot, except from one team, which was Unknown's team, who dropped at Reisshub Row, and they actually won 2 of the games being contested by P-God, Elige, and Jelty. A thing to note here is also that Doom's Domain and Stark Industries won 0 games in this finals. This is because most of the time the best teams are dropping here, or just teams that were really confident at fighting in these 2 drop spots. This made any of these fights really long and drawn out and just not worth taking. It was much better for these teams on average to land in uncontested POI, loot quickly, and then focus on their rotations and their positioning to get Storm Surge tags, which we'll discuss a little bit later. I did a little analysis of all of the regions and who came top 5 in each one, and 60% of the players who came top 5 in the region landed at an uncontested POI. Out of all of the drop spots on the map, the people who landed in Doom's Domain and Stark Industries and managed to come top 5 in the region took up a total of 22.9% of all of the players. However, only 4 of these people were actually contested off spawn and managed to make it to a top 5 in the region. The other 4 were completely uncontested off spawn and had dominant first performances by a huge margin, such as EU, which had Mongrel, Mitro, and Tayson completely dominate the region. So what's the main takeaway from this for a finals? Well, it's much better and more consistent to land at a POI that is uncontested and focus on getting off spawn every single game and having points every single game, rather than landing at Stark's Industries or Doom's Domain, where you may fight off spawn 50% of the time and win, and 50% of the time you may lose, losing out a huge amount of points. Unless, however, you manage to get these drops completely uncontested because you've managed to alpha it in the previous weeks and in scrims, and this is a huge factor in players who completely dominated the region and came first. I've talked a ton about deadside rotates in my videos and in my live streams if you want to watch me over on Twitch, but one of the things that I found very interesting is in this trios meta, not a huge amount of players were actually rotating deadside in the first and second zones, and instead they were just white lining to rotate as quickly as possible. So why were players just running straight for the zone rather than doing any form of deadside rotates? Well, it really comes down to priorities. It's not that rotating deadside is a bad thing, it's actually the safest way to rotate by far, and you're going to stay away from the most players possible. However, getting a centered position on a high ground early is actually one of the most important things in the trios meta, in particular when it comes to a finals. This doesn't really apply to an opens format. This is because Storm Surge is hugely prevalent, and you need to be getting into a good position on a high ground layer so that you can consistently hit Storm Surge tags over and over again. If you spend too much time deadside rotating, it's going to be a really long rotate to get you in, and you're going to get tagged up hugely on your way in. With the lower chest spawn rates, you're not going to have as many shields in your inventory, so it's going to be much more difficult for you to heal up, meaning you're going to have to make a psycho play, fight a team, which is consistently adding huge amount of risk to your gameplay. On average, teams were set up on a hill 2 minutes before the first zone has closed, and if you played any games and timed your rotations at all, you'll know this is really fast. A great example of this was Furious, Riversan, and Illist, who won the entire region, and they also won 3 games on NA East. They had 2 specific Storm Surge strategies that were clearly thought out in advance. If the zone was pulling north, one of their guys would rotate earlier. It was usually Illist or Furious who would go to the north, grab the hill up there, box up in brick, and just get Storm Surge tags that way. If it was pulling up to the northwest or west, they would go to the hill to the west. Very early, set up there, get Storm Surge tags every single game. The fact that Lazy Lake is relatively central to the map obviously really helps with this. There's not as many opportunities to deadside rotate from this position, and there's tons of hills already close to the drop, so you can be one of the first to get up onto one of those spots early. However, if you drop in another spot of the map, such as the Exit True who drops at the rig, there's also not a huge amount of hills around here. Plus, there's not that many players to fight if they've already rotated early as well. So what was their Storm Surge strategy? Well, they did the exact same thing. They tried to rotate in relatively early. They got into the first zone just before it closed, and yes, they did end up in this game actually fighting in Storm later on, which is a whole other thing. But they'd set up on this hill to the north of Weeping Woods here to grab the Storm Surge tags on the people coming from Holly Hedges. So in summary, it's not that deadside rotating is bad, it's just that rotating earlier and getting ahead of all of those other players, positioning yourself on a high ground position is just better. However, if you drop near the edge of the map and you have an opportunity to dead side rotate and claim a hill, please go ahead and do it. This next point, I'm really not going to go over too much because I've gone over it pretty much every single video I've ever talked about solos or trios before, but getting into the center of third zone was hugely beneficial and a huge factor to a ton of these guys' wins. This gives it the shortest time for you to rotate into the fourth zone when it appears, and this is obviously a really difficult zone to rotate in generally because there's so many people alive in such a small area. There's the summary of the point, go center third. Something that should surprise nobody is that taking height and having height was obviously the easiest way that the majority of these games were won. But how did they take height and when did they do it? Well, a lot of these teams actually took height as early as 4th zone, and I want to explain that a little bit. While they were setting up their position in the 4th zone, they ensured that they were on a relatively high layer. This means that if a 5th zone appears near them, they can just shockwave immediately onto that and claim height instantly. Or if they're already high in 4th zone and they get it exactly on them, they're already going to have height for the moving zones. Now obviously there's a couple requisites here. Firstly, you need shockwaves or bounce pads or crash pads to ensure that you can actually get up to height. If it's max distance zone, it's going to be much more difficult to do that as well, remember. Teams who took height in the 5th and then ended up winning the game, what they ended up doing was waiting for the zone to get a little bit ahead and then one member shockwaving ahead of zone. So once he'd got ahead of zone, he would build up in a separate area and then spray back and let the other two players also use some mobility, be it a bounce pad or a shockwave, and just fly across to them and secure that separate height. Having these two different points of high ground was a really good way to ensure that no one can take height from you, as you always have teammates with angles to spray if someone is trying to contest you. Once second moving starts, it's a lot easier to maintain height from this point onwards. You need to ensure that you do have a split on high ground though, at one player at the front, one player at the back, and ensuring one player is also a little bit higher up, which is usually the player at the back. This prevents players from shockwaving up onto you and knocking you completely out. This is something we saw Stompy and Shinken do a long time ago, all the way back in the World Cup, and has been an absolute staple all the way through duos, trios, and squads metas until then, and it's still very, very prevalent. Ensure that you have one player in your team a couple layers above, just to ensure that this height is way more secured. However, you don't only want a vertical split. A horizontal split gives you way more angles to get shots on players from below, and also prevents you from getting shockwaved up on even more. Be this one player being way further ahead of the zone and one being a little bit further back in terms of in the middle of the tarp, and then like I said already, the other player higher up at the back. Or you can split paths and have one person go to the right hand side of the zone where they'll be able to get great angles to beam players below and see players shockwaving up and not get knocked down himself, and one player all the way to the left hand side of the zone, which will create great pinching points to shoot players and get different angles all on the people below, allowing you higher eliminations. In Game 8, Pamstu, Carey and Artsy won with a fantastic shockwave play at the end of the second moving zone to take height, and they completely took advantage of the fact that the team on high ground was not paying attention to their split, having no vertical split and no horizontal split either. They all went into separate boxes, shockwaved up, and this knocked the entire team above them down, which meant that they could not even spray out our team while they were flying through the sky. This simple height retake was fantastic and won them the game. However, it really could have been prevented if the team on high ground had appropriately split high ground, having horizontal and vertical split. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. There's also a ton of other little bits and bobs that I wanted to put in because there's so many more tips that I learned from this. I'm going to put them in future videos coming up all through the season. I'm going to be doing weekly content all the way through FNCS, so really hope for that. Should be only trios content from now on up until the end of trio FNCS, where I'm obviously going to be doing every region VOD reviews. Hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said, catch you later. Peace!